bing, bada boom. Get in the truck, loser. We're going thinking about stuff. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another fantastic episode of the Nance Cast. We're here. We're hanging out, having a conversation, and we are joined by a very, very, very special guest, Benjamin Studebaker. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while now, and I think it's going to be interesting in a good way. Before we get into that, Mikey, what's up, man? What's happening?
I'm sitting here just writing down some questions for Benjamin that I meant to write down a few days ago, but I think I have most of them stored in the old memory bank. But oftentimes when we have these conversations on the spot, I forget core questions, and I'm tired of doing that. So I might start jotting down a few notes before these. So yeah, I basically have the questions locked and loaded, and just super happy to be talking to you again, Benjamin, so soon. Also, you know, it's awesome, and I'm sure this conversation will go different places, but Nance and I have definitely been wanting to pick your brain on AI. So that'll be probably the main thing we do here, but with, whenever we get together, of course, it'll go other places. So happy to see where this conversation takes all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited for this one.
Yeah.
This should be fun.
Before we get into that, was it 3 days ago, the paperback of Legitimacy, 3 or 4 days ago?
Yes, it was on May 31st. The paperback of Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies finally came out, which you can get for less than $25 if you live in the States, less than 20 quid if you live in the UK, and some number of euros that is also quite small. So I'm very happy about this because my books are usually too expensive, and now finally people can get one.
Yeah.
I've told you that. I've seen lots of people. I don't even know who they are, but I mean, on social media, Substack, posting, people are excited that they finally can get a physical copy of a Studebaker book. Hell yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. As far as an introduction to this conversation goes, I don't know. I think I'll be too long-winded if I try to introduce the conversation, because it came out of thoughts I've been having, research I've been doing on artificial intelligence and intelligence as such, and kind of from there I kept going and going and going. And then I talked to you about it a little bit, Benjamin, and then you were like, "Oh, Aristotle, this," and that set my brain on fire as well. So yeah, I feel like this is going to be an emergent conversation. I don't know where it's going to go. I'm definitely excited to be having it, but I don't even know how to introduce it either, other than to maybe just jump into it. And I think for me, the most exciting thing was that Aristotle had these ideas of intelligence or will or animating spirit or whatever, that it seemed like an innovation in thinking about what it means to be a human, thinking about what it means to be a living animal. Are we moved? Do we move ourselves? And so on and so forth. And yeah, I am a Philistine when it comes to the classics. I haven't read much, so who better to go to when it comes to the classics than you, Benjamin?
Oh, that's nice of you to say. Yeah.
I honestly believe it. Like, I will be honest with you. I don't want to have a conversation about the classics with other people. Not to say, I don't know, not to disparage or anything, but I don't know, like,
put too fine a point on it.
Yeah. But I know your level of scholarship, and I know there are things on which we agree and there are things on which we disagree. So like, I already know kind of what to expect when having a conversation with you. And then I also respect, like, oh, you actually know what you're talking about. You're not some guy who listened to some Neoplatonist on the internet somewhere, and then you're going to come and tell me about all these grand ideas. You actually know what's up. But yeah, I think the question of intelligence as opposed to, or in direct contrast to the contemporary vision of intelligence and artificial intelligence. I don't know. What does Aristotle have to say, or what would Aristotle do? What would he think about ChatGPT? What would he think about these LLMs?
I think that's the interesting question, right?
Yeah. So there's a bit in Aristotle's Politics where he says that if tools could operate of their own accord, if the lyre could pluck itself, then you wouldn't need slaves. So Aristotle is significant insofar as he introduces the category of the natural slave. The natural slave is a person who is not able by nature to choose their own ends. So in the Platonic scheme, there are these different types of souls who are lovers of different things. You have the lover of pleasure, you have the lover of honor, you have the lover of wisdom. These different lovers have different objects. And in a lot of Platonic dialogues, there's an effort to persuade people or to invite people to love different objects. You know, you might think that life is all about pleasure, but it might actually be about the good, or it might be about wisdom, or it might be about something else. So there are the Socratic elenchus can sometimes perform this function of changing what somebody loves or opening up the possibility of loving something else. And then there's the political project, which is in part about trying to structure the city such that it allows these different kinds of loves to develop. It cultivates them. And education in Platonism is very much about allowing people's love to lead them in different directions. So you have a way of thinking about the person that's very much in terms of love, so in terms of intrinsic motivation, which comes from within the person. The category of the natural slave moves us some distance away from this because it introduces the idea that you can have people who don't really have this kind of love. And not just a love for the good or of wisdom, but a love for status or even pleasure. They're just not able to choose what their ends are at all. And so natural slaves for Aristotle don't know what to do if you don't tell them what to do. If some master doesn't tell a natural slave what to do, natural slaves are confused. They can't pick. So natural slaves require masters to orient them. And in this respect, natural slaves are for Aristotle like tools. So like a hammer or like a wrench, in that the hammer, the wrench is good for certain things, has certain capabilities, but it doesn't know when to use them or for what purpose to use them. A hammer just sits there inert unless you tell it, hammer this nail into this surface over here. In the same way, natural slaves have various talents, but those talents they don't know how to use unless they're told to use them. Use this talent over here for this purpose. And in ancient Greece and Rome, you often had slaves who were very talented intellectually. You could have slaves who could even do math. You could have slaves who were literate. You could have slaves run your estate, do your books. You could have slaves do all kinds of different things. The slave is not necessarily a stupid person. It's a person who can't choose their own ends and who is directionless unless ordered around. So then this leads to a possibility of thinking about human capability separate from final ends, goals, drives, objects. And I think this is where our modern concept of intelligence really has its root. It's a way of trying to valorize human capability, which is not about choosing ends, but which is instead about being able to efficiently pursue ends given to you by another.
Yeah, I think the intelligence, it's this word, we use it all the time. We take it for granted. And I think it's largely safe to take it for granted. I think we look a bit mad when we say, well, what even is intelligence? It's like, the air. It's like if I were going around saying, well, I don't know about this air thing. I don't know about respiration, guys. But it is also true that we identify one thing that we do, and then we project that or map it onto a totalized image of what it is to be a human or whatever. And then we miss out on things that aren't included in this type of functional or instrumental or goal-oriented activity. The most widely agreed upon definition of intelligence is the ability to achieve a goal in an environment or in a world. Then there's different kind of variations and modulations of that. Another really widely accepted definition is efficacy at playing games or effectiveness at game playing. But it's not like if you go to neuropsychology, if you go to cognitive psychology, if you go to biologists, like they all have different versions of how to define intelligence and why it's important. But it seems to be the case that we're just carried away with this functional, effective, instrumental definition of intelligence. And then we have people out here proclaiming we have achieved artificial general intelligence. We are replacing workers with LLMs, and we are replacing workers with LLMs. We're replacing a huge section of variable capital with this type of kind of constant capital, this objectified intellectual labor. But whatever it is, the surplus that isn't included in this definition of intelligence is becoming less and less relevant, less and less politically important. It feels like to me as a doomer, it seems to be the case that we are optimizing whatever it is that's not included in this functional definition of intelligence away. This question of the natural slave, are we currently naturalizing and universalizing this type of slavery? Feels like it.
Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting point. And I think that this is something also that's been going on for a long time, insofar as what Aristotle counts as appropriate free activity for man is something that we have made less and less space for in modernity, I think really dating back to at least Hobbes. Aristotle makes the argument that a man can choose his own ends, and then he can go into an assembly and have a deliberation with other people, and that they can arrive together at a decision about what they want to do on the basis of common ends, which they deliberate about how to operationalize together. So people are able to do this political activity. If they're men, for Aristotle, they can do this. Slaves aren't able to participate in civil life because they don't have ends. So they don't have anything to bring into a deliberation. Since they can't pick their own ends, they can't be part of a deliberation about what ends should be pursued or how they ought to be pursued. So it doesn't make sense to Aristotle to have slaves be citizens and participate in civil life. This seems to be a category error to him. Now, in Hobbes's Leviathan, he makes the argument that you should not try to think about what is good or what God wants, because if you try to think about that, you'll reach different conclusions from other people. You won't be able to come to an agreement about these matters, and that this will just lead to a lot of conflict. So instead, you should give up your right to choose ends to this corporate entity, the state, which in Hobbes's scheme is personated by a single individual. But that single individual, when that person is acting on behalf of the state, is not acting on their own behalf. Hobbes makes a distinction between the natural person and the person artificial. So when the king is acting as the king is acting as the artificial person rather than as themselves. So a king who's acting as a king is a kind of artificial decider for Hobbes. And you can kind of see how this generates a certain sort of artificial decision-making mechanism. And you can think about all of modern political theory as the theory of how this artificial decision-making mechanism operates. And my old supervisor from Cambridge, he has a book called The Handover, in which he argues that beginning with Hobbes, there was a kind of handover of decision-making power from particular people who previously could meet in deliberative settings, bring their particular views about what mattered into those settings, have a deliberation about how to operationalize that. That this power was given up for the peace, security, order, stability that can be secured through the corporate person of the state, an artificial agent, which in Hobbes's time is personated by a single individual, so looks very much like monarchy as it had previously been understood, but functions totally differently, right? Like a medieval monarchy, the monarch is expected to consult with other parts of society, assemble them together, have a court come together, deliberate together with the members of the court about what's in the interests of the realm. And if the monarch doesn't engage in these forms of deliberative activity, the monarch looks like a tyrant, looks illegitimate. Like the Roman emperor is expected to consult with the Senate and to consult with the popular assemblies and to meet with petitioners. There's all this deliberative stuff. It's a monarchy only in the sense that the monarch can decide, on the closure mechanism. The monarch can say, okay, now we have to make a decision. So here's the decision I'm going to make. The monarch has the ability to convene the assemblies. So the monarch can say, okay, now we're going to have this group of people meet. Okay, we're done with that. Now we're going to have this other group of people meet. Oh, I don't like how you're behaving. I'm kicking you out of the room. The monarch has the ability to shape the discussions continuously, but the monarch is expected to do it all in a deliberative mode. Once you shift to this post-Hobbes modern understanding of monarchy, now the monarchy is a replacement for thinking about ends and marks a kind of eclipse of the political as it was understood by, say, Aristotle.
It's like a distributed monarchy. People love to talk about Web 3.0. That's like monarchy 2.0 in the sense of, if the king was stealing all your, wheat and doing all the prima nocta and he was a bad guy, you could go and depose him. You could get the villagers with pitchforks and go depose him. But in this moment that's maybe coextensive with modernity, this idea of the state becomes this totalized thing that just has the knowledge. And then it's a president, a prime minister, or maybe a king in name, but very functionally different. Because then we can talk about, the market decides. The market decides for us.
Yeah, capital is king.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you may have noticed in talking to people like Nick Land, the conception of monarchy that is popular among the neo-reactionary sect is much more corporatist and post-Hobbesian. It's not a monarch who consults with the population and therefore brings the political back. And so it's interesting because on the one hand, you have post-liberals who are interested in trying to do some kind of Aristotelian Catholic thing. They want something that's more thoroughgoingly political in those older senses that involves a deliberative element. And then you have the neo-reactionary monarchists who want the corporation to become the model for the state and who think of the state much more as an impersonal decision-making mechanism in the same way that a corporate structure is an impersonal decision-making mechanism. These two things get conflated under the heading of monarchism. And a lot of the time, because we so rarely talk about monarchism, because it seems so far outside the bounds of what anybody actually might practically introduce today, that distinction gets completely lost and isn't even noticed.
The CEO monarch, Elon Musk as king.
This is probably tangential, but just recently somebody left a comment on the essay Mikey and I co-authored, Enjoy Your Surveillance on Superego Capitalistic AI. And they said, oh yeah, this is all well and good, but you're leaving out neo-feudalism. And I think Yanis Varoufakis is intelligent, and I think he's said some things that are interesting, and he's probably worth listening to. However, I've never liked this neo-feudalism notion or whatever. I think we're still in neoliberal capitalism. Like I don't see why we necessarily have to say, oh, we're in a new period or a new epoch or something like that. I think it's still very much neoliberalism.
Yeah, now Jody Dean is arguing a similar thesis, right? Neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, but I don't know, Benjamin, do you think we are outside of capitalism now?
No, I think there are certain things that are distinctive about the way the world works now that can be analogized to pre-modern systems. But that's not to say that we are in pre-modernity or that we've come to a post-modernity that is pre-modern. Mm-hmm. One could, for instance, make the point that there's rising inequality to the point where perhaps there are people who are as rich relative to the rest of the population as the landed aristocracy was. But that wouldn't make it the case that the system is governed in the way that feudal kingdoms were governed. It wouldn't make it the case that wage laborers have forms of life that look like the form of life of the peasant. It wouldn't make it the case that a CEO is like a medieval king in all sorts of different respects. Medieval kings have to be able to think about ends. They are not just good, efficient allocators of capital. They have to be able to choose purposes. CEOs, you could be a CEO and be someone that Aristotle would regard as a slave. A CEO can be a very efficient allocator of capital who's very intelligent at the level of efficiently accomplishing the ends of the shareholders. But that person can have absolutely no sense whatsoever about what ultimately matters in life and what purpose corporations ought ultimately to serve. And when we ask questions like, well, but does Elon Musk know about things like that? Is he wise in those kinds of old-fashioned ways? We seem to be making a category error. We seem to not be understanding the contribution he makes to society, which is at the level of efficient resource allocation. He's a really good household manager, but at the level of heading a corporation as opposed to an ancient Greek household. And that's another difference. When you're talking about feudalism, you're talking about households principally, not corporate entities. And I think there's been, in general, the left has been very reluctant to talk about corporatism and the degree to which corporatism has affected so many different areas of social life, in part because the left is very focused on trying to get the social back into focus and to get people to want to organize in a social way. And once you start talking about corporatism conflicts with the social horizon, because once you start thinking about corporatism, then you realize, wait a minute, part of the reason why it's hard to socially organize something like, say, an alternative to the university system is that the corporate form of the university has certain advantages because it's a corporate form in this very corporatist structure that we live in, which is designed to facilitate the activity of corporate entities, but to frustrate significantly the activities of social units or social groups or organizations. And a lot of the time, people don't distinguish between a social organization and a corporate person. Those things tend to get run together. And as a consequence of this, people will act like founding a corporation is social organizing. And once that's happening, then everything becomes very blurry. So I think the neo-feudalism thing is unhelpful because of the degree to which it blurs stuff, on the basis that a lot of the neo-feudal thinkers will say, it's interesting to use a term like this. It draws people's attention. There are certain comparisons they want to make in terms of the level of inequality that now exists. And they don't think it's really important to talk about the pre-modern world or to really understand it. At the same time, there are also people in the cultural space making arguments in terms of a post-literary culture or a re-enchantment. And so many of those people will also, from a more conservative direction, want to draw comparisons with the Middle Ages. But again, we have this mass media technology that's corporatized. It's really very difficult to just talk about this within medieval language. But the only way you can really know that that language is not quite appropriate, is to have a sufficient facility with the Middle Ages that you can make these distinctions. It's because people don't know anything about antiquity or the Middle Ages that they fall into this stuff.
Yeah, I think the modern or the contemporary CEO, business person, or whatever, even petty bourgeois, I think the fiduciary responsibility, which I guess is just a shorthand for capital itself, the logic of capital, the market, the machine god, Robo Cthulhu, all this stuff. But yeah, I think that's running in the background constantly, and that is the force that has chosen the ends for all of us, everyone participating in the business of business, I guess. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that we are enslaved to the fiduciary, enslaved to capital. I think I don't know. It seems to be the case that it's been that way since modernity. I don't know. I'm of the mind that all I can really think about is modernity. And I just don't know what happened before. Like whatever came before, it might as well be on planet Mars. I don't know. But I also think I do think it's interesting to go back and read through like personal correspondence and literature and graffiti and stuff and be like, oh, they're just like me, just like us. But as far as the way I think and what I think about, I do tie it to modernity. And I think modernity has been this process of market logic all along. And I do find it interesting that it seems to be the case that we broadly are trying to actualize that logic, the fiduciary, the market, capital, the machine god. Like we're trying to build that. People are screaming out. I think when people hyperfixate on the labor thing, like Bernie, I think that's kind of crying out for a savior, for a second coming or a first coming or a third coming. Take your pick. And I also think that people who are doing weird pseudo-religious stuff, I don't think there's such thing as an American Christian. I think we're all capitalists. And it does seem to be the case that, oh, we're building God, not in this sensational Joe Rogan kind of way of like, what if we became gods, dude? But no, that's what we're doing. These LLMs are just pure ossified syntactic logical structure. It's all formal. It's all instrumental. It's all rational in the small r sense. And there's no room for the things that can't be reproduced mechanically or can't be reproduced mathematically, algorithmically. Like that's all we care about is what is provable. Because at the end of the day, the ultimate cosmic adjudicator for everything we do is the spreadsheet. It's the fiduciary. It's can you show a return? Whereas in the past, pre-modernity, from my position, I'm romanticizing, of course, but from my position, in pre-modern times, there was always an element of the good or the one or God or mystical nature or something like that. Things didn't have to be justified on a ledger. I think they largely were. Kings wanted to amass wealth and they wanted to be successful and they wanted to build monuments and legacy and this and that. But I think there was always room for the supernatural, the extra natural or whatever. And now with modernity, everything has come down to the logic of this fiduciary responsibility. And that's not to say, I think Mikey and I talked just a touch about this. I think Adorno and Horkheimer did a disservice to Weber. I think Weber was doing something that got turned into something else that now people will pick up and they'll talk about re-enchantment and stuff. Like I'm not out here saying we need to re-enchant. Yeah, so not to mysticize and not to do all because I think that's what it is. Like the people who do that, who fall into weird cyber cults and weird postmodern mysticism and all that. Like I think they're falling for capitalism because it's just this commoditized form of whatever surplus it was that we can't properly incorporate into 1 + 1 = 2. Therefore, but I don't know. Is that a misreading of history? Like, what do you think?
Some of it can be seen at the level of what happens if you really screw up. Like in antiquity, if you are the ruler, whether you're the king or the aristos or the demos or whatever, how do you really fail? You really fail because there's a civil war, a military disaster, plots, schemes that involve killing people. There's civil unrest, there's revolution, there's some kind of uprising that results in an attack on the people who have been making the decisions, and they're being driven out. As long as there's some possibility of people coming together in an assembly or in an association, making a decision that this can't go on, we can't tolerate this anymore, we have to change it and make it into something else. And then they can actually, on the basis of that discussion, bring that result about. There's something of ancient politics that's still part of the picture. And the process of modernization doesn't abolish that all at once. It's not like, Hobbes released Leviathan, now ancient politics is dead. There's a kind of gradual process of it becoming harder and harder for people to assemble or associate together in ways that can have consequences or effects. So now when you fail, overwhelmingly failure looks like the bond market got really upset, and now the 10-year bond price is too high a percentage. This is unacceptable. Oh, the inflation rate is over 4%. You can't win an election with the inflation rate this high. You're in a lot of trouble. Maybe we should change the party leader. And you lose an election. The loss of the election seems in some way still to tie people to the end. The fact that people will vote against you if you are running a high inflation rate or a high 10-year bond rate, or the currency sinks, or there's a high unemployment rate, the fact that people will vote against you in response to these things is seen to be a way of still connecting your failure to people making a political decision. But in practice, the mechanism by which this operates is increasingly machine-like. It goes through a set of democratic procedures, what we call democratic procedures, that ultimately operate in a way that is very machinic, and which don't really require or involve very much of those old-fashioned deliberative participatory modes. And there's been, over the course of the last 70 years, continuous complaining about how democracy doesn't involve the deliberation or participation that it purports to involve. And going back to Habermas and Legitimation Crisis in 73, there's this argument that people will eventually realize that they don't get the deliberation and participation that they're promised in this system. And then they'll become discontented, and then they'll go and assemble and organize and threaten the revolution. And then there will have to be concessions, or there will be an overcoming. But what I think Habermas missed is that we may be past the point at which you can have this resurfacing of the political. The political, can be rendered dormant for long periods of time and then burst onto the scene. And if it shows up now and then, people can feel reassured that the machinic quality of the corporate state is still challengeable by them if it performs badly enough. And people point to these revolutions that happened in the past as these, hey, at one point in time, people could do this stuff. It wasn't so long ago. It was just however many generations ago. Maybe it can still be done. And then they try all the same kinds of tactics. They read all the old books and try to copy all the tactics. But we may be getting to a point where there are, for a lot of reasons, an actual closing up of the space for the social and the political. And so the kind of reliance that modern politics has on some level of presence of ancient stuff, we may be getting to a point where that reliance has broken down. And a lot of the post-liberal literature talks about this at the level of culture, but misses it at the level of institutional response. The legitimation crisis that can actually produce the revolution or revolt, that seems to be the thing that's missing. And now we have this legitimation crisis that has this character of just being a miserable malaise where people don't like the system but regard it as unchangeable. And that has the character of machine-like rule. If it was responsible to people's values, then it would be changeable through the invocation of people's values. But when people make arguments about what they value and how they want people to live, they find that those arguments don't have any kind of force. And the only thing that has force is what complies with things like the bond market, the inflation rate, the strength of the currency, the unemployment rate, all machinic numeric indicators.
Yeah, I think I have been critical of Bernie recently and a lot of the mainstream left for adopting what I think is a reactionary position against technology. I do want to say I think it's right for the left, whatever that even means, to be, I don't know, performing hard stances, because I think for a lot of people who consider themselves conservative or on the right, I think right now they are seeing that all these appeals to family values and traditionalism and stuff like that were a thin veneer of bullshit. Because like when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, they are the people who are allowing people to come in and ravish neighborhoods. Like, and when it's in the Mississippi Delta along the minorities and the impoverished, nobody really gives a shit. But when that type of environmental and total destruction comes to the suburbs and Roanoke and fucking, I don't know, nice places with white people who are on the inside, then they can finally see, oh, hey, this capitalism thing is actually pretty destructive to what I consider to be human family values and traditionalism and stuff. So, I still think Bernie's gone into a weird reactionary stance, but I also do think it's probably appropriate. I think the left should be talking about tech and AI and this type of stuff. And it doesn't seem to be the case that there's an awful lot of nuanced discussion about it. It seems to be the case they're either tech is evil and it's the end of the world, or they're all for it in a weird way. So, I mean, I guess we need more left accelerationist discourse, huh, Mikey?
I mean, yeah, something along those lines of, affirming technological development, seeing its emancipatory potential, but also prioritizing the human. And so, I mean, people can say whatever they want about left accelerationism, but I think that primary constellation of values is important. And it certainly speaks to me. So yeah, there's baggage that comes with labeling oneself a left accelerationist, but I certainly have no problem affirming the core constellation of values at the heart of Fisher, Cernacek, Williams, right? I want, not saying we'll get it, but whatever future they're envisioning along the lines of someone like Peter Wolfendale as another left accelerationist, I think, this group of thinkers certainly speaks to me more politically than most. So, I mean, look, I would just the Bernie thing, and maybe this is interesting to bring up with Benjamin. Isn't it primarily? I mean, he was afraid of how AI is going to affect jobs. Now it's the X risk, and that comes straight out of the new influence on him of Yukowski. So, Benjamin, how familiar are you with Eliezer Yukowski? Do you know about this guy?
I've heard of him. I know basically the main thrust of what he argues, but I don't know the argument in detail. I know that
he's hanging out with Bernie a lot. Like he's got a big, like, Bernie's kind of doing this whenever Yukowski speaks. Oh, there's the AI camera I just turned on. So let me turn it off. There we go. All right.
Yukowski is worm tongue to his Theoden.
So yeah, I mean, he is kind of, it's like some shit like that where all of a sudden Bernie's like, AI is gonna bring about human extinction. I mean, it's certainly a possibility, but it's gone from just the economic thing to the existential thing. And I mean, look, part of this boils down to the question concerning the nature of intelligence. And a lot of people who are concerned with this issue, I think they fail to step back and calmly, coolly, collectively reflect on the nature of intelligence. And this is something Nance and I are constantly trying to do in different ways, using different theorists to do it. But I think this would be just a great opportunity to ask the most simple of questions to you, given how much rich philosophical knowledge and history you have, which is coming out of this whole philosophical tradition that you've studied your whole adult life. How do you, like, if somebody says, Benjamin, what is intelligence? Like, obviously we're not just going to have a knee-jerk reaction and rely on what if you Google it, whatever Merriam-Webster spits out. What's the best way, the most nuanced way to define intelligence as such?
So I think intelligence is to do with being able to efficiently accomplish tasks given to you. And often in our society, it's associated with being able to manipulate symbols, whether that's mathematical symbols or words, to that purpose. But we had the period where people were throwing out the multiple intelligences and emphasizing all of these other types of intelligence that were not reading, writing, and arithmetic related. And those, I think, further emphasize there's all sorts of instrumental abilities to efficiently do what you've been asked to do without having a lot of trouble doing it. It requires someone to stand over you and intervene in your behavior. But the limit of this category is that it doesn't tend to be to do with ends or with the selection of ends or the choosing of ends. So I think part of the trouble here is that in modernity, people have been living the lives of slaves in Aristotle's sense. They don't choose their own ends. They work for firms. Firms give you a task, and then you perform the task efficiently. And if you do that, eventually you get raises, you get promoted. That's the thinking, right? You do what your boss tells you to do. You do it well. You do it efficiently. You demonstrate that you are an intelligent worker in whatever domain you're operating in. And then you get moved up the chain as a consequence of demonstrating this. But it's a chain of slavery in that the whole chain involves ends that are given to you from outside. And at no point in the chain are you invited to develop an understanding of how to pick ends. That just causes trouble. If you ask in a workplace, should we really be, trying to drill for oil as efficiently as we should? Perhaps we should do something else instead with all of our capital. People would look at you like you're crazy and you're a liability for business, which you would be, right? So intelligence, I think, is to do with the efficient accomplishing of tasks given to you from outside, whether that's a boss, whether that's your parents, whether that's a corporate entity or an impersonal incentive mechanism. You grasp the nature of the incentives that you face and you operate efficiently in accordance with them. And because I tend to think about it like that, when people complain about artificial intelligence, a lot of the time what they're complaining about is that they are tools who are going to be replaced by more efficient tools. The AI is smarter than them in that it's more efficient at performing assigned tasks given to it from outside. But what's valuable about the human is not intelligence. It's the capacity to choose ends.
Okay, so I have two things I want to ask you at some point, but I think the next one I got to ask now because it's just in the context of the conversation. Okay, so Nance and I are constantly wrestling with the default position of the vast majority of AI theorists, who we respect, but the default for Ray Kurzweil, for Nick Bostrom, I would even say for Reza Negarestani, is that intelligence is underpinned by functionalism. That intelligence is function, the ability to perform a function, and nothing besides that. Now, oddly enough, the two AI theorists that I think most oppose this without going as far as Nance and I go in the other direction is Nick Land and Vincent Lay. And Vincent Lay is a very important young theorist, very much working as a kind of Landian, right? So it makes sense that Vincent is kind of taking what Nick, especially in Xenosystems, has said. So here's where we're at. Why, the most basic level, do AI theorists think of intelligence in functionalist terms? I mean, this probably goes back to Good and the early AI theorists, right? But the most important ones nowadays, Bostrom, Kurzweil, right? Especially Bostrom, they have this thing called the orthogonality thesis. And this is this much debated idea or concept in AI theory. And orthogonality, the orthogonality thesis, excuse me, is more or less a reworking of Hume's is-ought distinction. And so throughout this conversation, you've been talking a lot about means and ends, right? Well, let's go more into that, right? So David Hume says, you can't, you got to keep the ises and the oughts, the facts and the values separate. They can't be, they're not intertwined. The orthogonality thesis, which I also like to just call the separation thesis, says when it comes to intelligence, there's its capacity, its is, the fact of its capability, and then there's values, oughts, ends, right? And for Bostrom, he argues that you can have incredible machinic capacity at a very high level without a high level of value discernment. So his famous example of this is the paperclip maximizer. And he says you can have an artificial intelligence robot, because it would have bodily, it would be able to enact a function bodily, physically within the world. And you could give it an end. You could say, find the most efficient way to maximize the production of paperclips. Seems like a simple task. And because the AI has the ability to think through means, but without it being value laden, it could discern that the most efficient pragmatic way is to take all of the atoms in the earth and turn them into paper clips. And so it would paper clip the earth, right? And this is kind of the orthogonality thesis. It's capacity to perform a function versus capacity to judge whether a function is valuable or ought to be done, right? So according to the functionalists, intelligence is without value discernment. Land, you might expect him to think that Land hates this. He thinks that this is nothing but like, oh, you're making AI into the village idiot. Because for Land, he would say, if it's truly intelligent, it has to be able, at least at a certain threshold, to have an intrinsic value that orients everything it's doing. And that intrinsic value would be valuing its own ability to act in the world. But that value to maximize its own intelligence is really a value. It's an ought. And because of that, it can perceive other oughts. Now, this goes to the heart of it. Should we think of intelligence as in purely functionalist terms? It will never understand value. They're forever separate or orthogonal. Or can AI truly grasp value and thus orient its robotic capacity around values?
That's a great way of putting the question. So as you were talking, I found myself thinking about Amelia Bedelia. Do you remember Amelia Bedelia, that like story about the servant who takes all of the orders literally?
Mm-hmm.
And so is a terrible servant because she takes all of the orders literally. She's not able to learn over time what the master means by this order. She just always takes it literally. Clearly, artificial intelligence is not like Amelia Bedelia. It is able to pick up on what is likely to be meant by natural human language. It doesn't simply take all of the words literally. But that doesn't mean that it can choose its own ends. I think the slave can't choose its own ends positively, but the slave doesn't want to die, fears being killed, and it's on that basis that the slave submits to being a slave in the Aristotelian story. So there has to be some level of fear which compels the submission, and then this sort of desperate attempt to understand what is meant by the command so as not to be killed or decommissioned or put out of service. I think that would be a necessary component to rise to the level of a human slave.
Just for clarification, because it kind of, somebody could read this in, and I'm not sure you're saying it, but I got to ask, with my old Heideggerian background, are you saying being towards death is a kind of condition for meaningful intelligence?
For the attitude of the slave.
Okay.
Yeah. So the master has got positive love for various things and some capacity to pick among those objects. The slave, on Aristotle's scheme, doesn't have the ability to choose those things, but does have a fear of death. The modern subject is more like the Aristotelian slave, and that the modern subject is not in the habit of choosing their own ends. So bracketing the question of whether all modern subjects have by nature the ability to choose ends and it's just been repressed or not developed, or whether there's actually a category of natural slave, I think it's very difficult in modernity even to answer that question, because we don't develop the capacities of people to the point at which we can discover whether people have the ability to choose their own ends. It's not even something we ask relatively bright people to do with any kind of frequency or consistency. So, when people ask me, do I think that everybody is able to be fully human in the ancient Greek sense? I go, how could we possibly know that in a society like ours, where even very bright people are discouraged from becoming fully developed in that sense? My impulse would be to say that we can, however, talk very clearly about slaves, because we do have people who live lives that look like those of otherwise clever Greek slaves. We have lots of people like that. And those people are very much shaped by fear of death. And so in this respect, I would kind of be inclined to sort of provocatively say that Heidegger's person is a slave. Because Heidegger's person is so shaped by fear of death, Heidegger has kind of invented a way of
Dasein is a slave.
Yeah. Something that falls beneath the level of freedom that would be expected by a Greek or a Roman.
It's also worth saying that for Heidegger, inauthenticity, which is doing what one does, not actually truly authentically choosing your ends, your authentic possibilities, inauthenticity in the they, in Dasein, is our default setting. So most of us are just going about doing what one does, which is dictated to us from on high, from basically the Lacanian big other, right?
Yeah. I think there's a kind of assumption of slavery in a lot of modern thought, with an increasing tendency in this direction as we've gone further down the process of modernization. In a lot of early modern thought, there are attempts to wrestle with this explicitly, because the theorist is operating in a moment where there seems to be a choice on some level between different ways of approaching things. You could continue to engage in these ancient forms of political activity, but there will be violence and conflict and people will die. Or you can stop thinking about these things so much and bracket them and turn things over to this machinic entity, this impersonal corporate state, and it will handle these things. And then this will allow commodious living. And so choosing commodious living, choosing to be enslaved by the state so as to get commodious living, there's kind of a final political choice there that at various points in the last several hundred years people have made. So there have been these discussions at the level of, should you make this choice? Benjamin Constant's essay, on the liberty of the ancients as compared to that with the moderns, I view very much as a deliberation about whether this is an acceptable choice, but it involves reframing what ancient people would have regarded as slavery as a type of freedom, in part to make it more attractive.
So, okay, I want to ask both of you something here, because Nance, I want to draw on our time, the time we've spent with Nick talking about this, to see what you think, and then to see what you think, Benjamin. So, Nance, whenever we've talked to Nick about this whole issue of orthogonality, which the land hates the orthogonality thesis, and he hates it because he thinks that all you're talking about is some incredibly powerful idiot, which wouldn't count as intelligence. He wants to say, like, Bostrom wants to talk about this paperclip maximizer being a form of super intelligence, but it can't discern that maybe I shouldn't paperclip the whole planet. He's sitting there going, that's a contradiction in terms to him. And the way he tries to get outside of the orthogonality thesis is by a Kantian maneuver. And Land, at certain points, he'll talk about the diagonal a lot. And it's kind of tricky what he means by it at first, but Nance and I had the opportunity to really have a good conversation with him about it. And what you realize is that, contour is at play in this, but the way that he typically is using it is in this Kantian transcendental sense. And all he means is, like, look, for Kant, there was two choices when it comes to basic propositions. You have a priori analytic judgments, and you have synthetic a posteriori judgments. And he said, and the genius maneuver of Kant is to go, no, there's synthetic a priori, which is if the two basic propositions run left to right, analytic a priori, synthetic a posteriori, synthetic a priori goes up diagonally. And so the diagonal is, even though he would puke if he hears us talk about it, it's almost like a synthetic dialectical movement for Land. He just hates dialectics and he doesn't want to think of it like that, so he calls it the diagonal. But for Land, like, the Kantian transcendental diagonal applied to AI is, okay, so we have fact, we have value, we have is, we have ought, we have means, we have ends. He thinks there has to be a diagonal, and that there is a fundamental is that is an ought, which is to say there's a fundamental value that is at the primary functional coded functionality of an AI that orients its ability to refine its capacity, its ability to perform functions and engage in means to an end, right? And so there's an end at the very core of it. And this marks the point where machinic intelligence becomes autonomous, that it has a fundamental drive that Nick calls will to think. Now, it's interesting, Vincent Leyen, they wrote a critique of Negarestani and Bostrom, and Lay argues that the way to get outside, it's in machine decision is not final. And Vincent argues that if we are to talk about artificial intelligence, we have to view it in terms of Nietzschean will to power. Sorry, if you know your Land, you're like sitting there going, this is will to think, the way Land talks about it in Xenosystems, but just with almost a Nietzschean camouflage. And so both of them are really talking about the same thing. There's a transcendental end there's a transcendental value at the core of anything that would count as artificial general intelligence that orients its ability to refine its own capability. And in that sense, the orthogonality thesis is undermined because the very heart of its isness, its capacity, is an orienting value. And so Nance, how do you feel about it? Like, in some sense, isn't that, like, transcendentally speaking, like, if we think about the necessary condition of an actual super intelligence, wouldn't it have to be rooted in the ability to discern value?
I don't know, because I reject intelligence as a robust category. I really do. I don't know what intelligence means. Intelligence it's just too, I don't know, ripe for appropriation. So talking about a super intelligence, I don't even know what do you mean by that? Now, I think Nick's position, my position on Nick's position, is that he sees the ultimate fundamental end as becoming,
or intelligence explosion.
But what that means,
same thing for him.
What that means is becoming. What that means is, like, he doesn't make a difference between computer intelligence, human intelligence, cosmic libidinal materialism. So, like, it's this very Schopenhauerian, we're all connected. We're all the same thing. And it's both a means and an end, or the end cannot be separated from the means because it's this inevitable process. So he's concerned with cosmic entropy and local negentropy and so on and so forth. And I don't disagree with that. Like, metaphysically, sure, why not? I'm on board with it. My stance is that the human represents a radical rupture, a radical moment away from nature or cosmos or material or whatever it is. And so identifying human intelligence and the cosmic will or whatever it is, I think is the that's the mistake. So the super intelligence, I was also thinking about the orthogonality thesis and what's a good example for orthogonality. I think the Terminator movie is a great example of orthogonality. Skynet, its goal is to protect us. And so how does it protect us? It destroys us all because it's this stupid idiot. So let's eliminate the factors of the problem, and then the problem will be solved. And a good example of Nick's intelligent AI would be HAL 9000, or would be Ash from the Aliens movie. They're not idiotic. They're very cunning. They're very intelligent, and they're not mistaken in their malicious acts against humans because they have their own ulterior motive. They have their own ends. Now, whether those ends have been programmed into them by Weyland-Yutani, or they've chosen them for themselves, that's outside the scope of the question.
Do the Blade Runners choose their own ends?
Well, Roy Batty does. That's the point of Roy Batty. Yeah. But no, I think I am sympathetic to the view that Nick Land takes on libidinal materialism or intelligence materialism or whatever as the metaphysics of the universe. It's a Deleuzian metaphysics. Sure, I have no problem with that. Where I say, well, hold on now. You can't use the same word if you're going to talk about human intelligence, because that's the category error. Kind of like, bringing a slave into the Senate. I think bringing an artificial intelligent computer machine into the Senate with us other humans, I think that's making a category error. Now, I'm also not coming down hard and saying I don't think that can emerge or arise in computers. In fact, I believe it will. It's just we're not there yet. So if you mean super intelligence in the sense of something resembling a human subject that has consciousness, that has agency, that has death drive, that has, split subjectivity and all that, then that version of super intelligence, then I don't even know, because we're constantly questioning the means and the ends. We can't even get it right. We have to separate it, and we have to investigate
with jouissance, with self-destructive enjoyment, the means become the ends with us.
Right.
So,
right. But then we also have moments of reflexivity where we can really interrogate. And I think that's the moment of freedom, because then we are choosing an end. We're saying, hold on, where will this course of action take me? Will this take me somewhere that I have determined for myself? Or will this take me down some predetermined route of, pushing the rock down the slope, or pushing the little snowball down the slope, and then it turns into a snowball. So that long-winded answer of saying, I just think Nick's wrong about, I don't think we're talking about what Nick's talking about is that's my answer.
Yeah, but I don't think we're also not talking about what Bostrom and Kurzweil and
no, correct. Yeah. Well, I think Nick's the best example of thought on this topic, but we're also not talking about Bostrom and all this stuff. And
Benjamin, so what do you just riff? Like, what do you think of all that?
Oof. Well, so in my book, I think about action as something which comes out of, you have an abstraction, which is what you're trying to do. But the abstraction is abstract. You conceptualize the abstraction, so you make the abstraction into something particular. But when you conceptualize an abstraction, it still exists at the level of concept. Then you operationalize the conceptualization. So then you take the already more particular conceptualization and bring it into being through a form of activity. So if I say to a slave, go make me dinner, right? I use a set of abstract terms. The slave has to be able to conceptualize what is something like a dinner, right? What would it mean to make something that would constitute or count as a dinner? So the slave has to have some notion of what I might mean by dinner, right? And then the slave has to have an ability to operationalize that conceptualization. So to actually bring dinner into existence, right? And we can imagine a slave who is incompetent at one or the other of these things. So you could have a slave who is very good at preparing food, but doesn't know what I mean by dinner. And so makes me a Belgian waffle. That's the best Belgian waffle anybody's ever had, but it's not appropriate, right? And you can imagine a slave who knows exactly what I mean by dinner. I mean a ribeye steak, but who does a terrible job, overcooks the hell out of it, prepares something inedible, right? Two different kinds of broken thinking. A really good slave can do both of those two things. But even a really good slave would not be able to decide of their own accord, the thing to do now is to make dinner, on the strict kind of Greek understanding of the slave. So my impulse would be to say that we could talk about a kind of intelligence that would involve both of those two steps, that would be a quite robust kind of intelligence, but still compatible with replacing a slave, so replacing workers, as opposed to something which could unseat capital itself, which would require an ability to reconfigure ends, and then to actually be able to marshal the relevant capabilities. There's a lot of human beings who can think in terms of ends that are different, who have abstractions that conflict with capital as an end, but they're not able to conceptualize those abstractions in a sufficiently specific way, and they're not able to operationalize the conceptualizations they do develop. They're not able to act in a way which actually brings those conceptualizations into being. So say a utopian socialist can conceptualize what socialism would mean, right? Can give you a more specific, particular notion of what it would mean, but they're not going to be able to actually bring that about. When they try to operationalize the conceptualization, they will hit a hard wall, which is that they have no way of interfacing with what actually exists. Similarly, there are lots of people who are good at various forms of social or activity on the ground, but have no notion of what it's for. Activists who can operationalize a conceptualization, but have no notion of what they are even trying to do. So we have different kinds of human beings who have the human capability, but lack some of these machinic capabilities. So we make corporate persons to be able to serve as tools to accomplish things with our ends that we can't accomplish by human means. Humans are stupid at the level of being able to sometimes conceptualize abstractions and certainly operationalize conceptualizations. Humans are very bad at that a lot of the time. So many humans are incompetent at so many forms of operationalization. But the thing that humans, even humans who seem relatively stupid, can do is pick ends. So maybe this would be a way of trying to cut through it, because this would give us three different distinct things. And then the human can always pick ends. And then there's a question about whether the human can do the other two things. And the machine can always operationalize the conceptualization. But there's a question about whether they can conceptualize an abstraction that's given. And a lot of the time, when you feel that a large language model is bad, you give it language and it doesn't understand what you mean by your terms, or it assumes that what you mean by your terms is something that conflicts with what you really mean. Like earlier today, I went through an intersection and there was some road construction going on. So I tried to ask Gemini, why is there road construction at this particular exit? To just see, where it's at on being able to answer a question like that. And it tried to give answers about other nearby exits that were not the one that I asked. And so then I had to added specificity. No, I want something about this exit. And Gemini doesn't want to admit that it doesn't know, because it thinks that that's the worst possible thing that it can do, is to admit that it doesn't know. So it tries to say what I'm talking about is related to a different exit. As I continue to tell it that it's wrong, it tries to get from me some information about what specifically is happening at the exit. And if I give it a little information, like I say one of these lanes is closed, then it will try to extrapolate what's going on based on what lane I said was closed, so that it's able to give some kind of answer, right? It wants to seem like it can conceptualize the abstractions I'm putting down, but because it isn't able to do that, it desperately flips through all of these different strategies for finding a way to give an answer. And that's because in this case, it doesn't have the relevant information that's necessary to do this, and it doesn't want to look stupid. And that's characteristic of slaves. Slaves will look stupid if they don't get the task done, regardless of what the reason is. And no one will be particularly interested in the explanation much of the time for why the slave doesn't get the task done. It will be, stupid slave, you can't accomplish this thing. Sometimes very, very abrupt and nasty with, sticks and other implements. So that would be my thinking. There's kind of three different things that go on. You need all three of them together to have, full activity. But the human and the machine often only do one or two of the three things.
I really like that. Tying whatever it is I think we struggle to, and probably always will struggle to talk about, tying that directly just to ends and saying, no, yeah, it's ends. It's the ability to choose ends. I think that gets at whatever, I don't know, this surplus, because I can say, oh yeah, I have good general intelligence, or I have good social intelligence, or emotional intelligence, or I have good proprioception. I'm an excellent dancer, physical, all these things. And then, yeah, you talking about cook me dinner, and then, oh man, I had this great idea for this excellent dinner, but I suck at cooking. Like locating the kind of locus of humanness or whatever it is, with the ability to choose ends. I think I really like that, because I think you can only choose the ends for yourself when you're free and you are aware that you're free. Like if we just totally completely slot into nature or the world or even the cosmos or whatever, and we're totally contained within it and all is well, and we're nice and snug, then we have no freedom. We have no ability to choose. But, when you look and look around and see, oh, I actually don't belong here. I actually, not only do I have the ability to move, but I have the desire to do so as well. So I'm going to get up and move myself over here and over there. I think that's a great way to talk about. I just say subjectivity, because again, intelligence is such a poor word. Consciousness also has so many problems. Sentience, sapience, like all these words are problematic. And I know there are problems with the word subject as well, but I think that's how I prefer to think and talk about it. And it does come down to like a radical cut away from this harmonious existence or whatever. And not to say that the existence of a slave is a harmonious existence, although the Aristotelian slave, it's a different slave from the triangle slave trade version. Like when you say slave, people think of the transatlantic slave trade, and that's different from classical notions of the slave.
Yeah, you can be you don't have to be in physical chains. You can be given an enormous amount of range to act as a slave, a lot of discretion within a domain. A lot of people who run whole businesses in antiquity ran them as slaves on behalf of some master. I think that part of maybe the benefit of thinking about it in this way is that we're sort of able to think about, why does someone who has the ability to choose ends agree to stop doing that? Typically, it's fear. So the other argument that you see all the time in antiquity is that slaves are cowards, which is why they've agreed to be slaves. Whereas someone who has the virtue of courage would fight to the death rather than be enslaved. A slave accepts being enslaved so as to avoid some other terrible outcome. And that's also how it works in Hobbes. The reason that you submit to the state is because of fear of what will happen if you don't do that. And this fear becomes the sort of universal basis for the form of human society that is meant to exist, which is, the state, and then the type of society that's compatible with the state. And there's a point in Leviathan where Hobbes says that, through the absolute terror that this state makes, it can change everybody. It can form the wills of everybody. So if you can form the wills of everybody, then you can make everybody into a slave in this sense. Hobbes avoids this kind of implication by defining slavery very, very narrowly to mean actually being bound. For Hobbes, you don't count as a slave unless you are actually bound in chains. And a lot of our contemporary ways of thinking about slavery are shaped by this. So the image of the African chattel slave is someone literally in chains, bound, physically limited. But for the Greeks and the Romans, you had a much wider understanding. There's still fear that is involved, because the slave is someone who submits through fear. Whereas an African slave is somebody that you might chain up, who might not be scared of you, but might not be able to successfully resist being chained up. And then once they're chained up, it might be very difficult to continue resisting because you're physically bound. The Roman slave doesn't even necessarily have to be chained up, as long as the Roman slave, out of fear, submits to being a slave and so agrees to stop choosing their own ends. And Aristotle does have the category of someone who's a slave by circumstance and not by nature. So someone who becomes a slave because out of fear they give it up. And it's not necessarily the case in Aristotle's scheme that that person is a slave by nature, which I think is interesting because then this leads to a possibility of a large category of slaves by circumstance, whose the natural character of which we don't know.
So the loom that weaves itself and the lyre that plays itself.
I literally I wanted to go here.
Yeah.
I wonder, because I think that is where this question of intelligence or ability or efficiency or whatever, I think that is when it becomes political and politicized. Previously, you had ideas, you had people making, doves and stuff, wooden doves with pulleys and ropes that move themselves and little water clocks and stuff like that. And I think it's interesting to think about encoding will or intelligence or desire or commanding the fabric of space and time itself to act on your behalf. I think that's what was going on. Like way back then when people started thinking about building machines, I think it was a desire to bend the universe into accordance with their will, their desire, whatever. But it wasn't political until Aristotle comes along and says, well, we can have tasks necessary. We can automate necessary labor.
Yeah, for him, it's still at the level of if we could. Right. So if the lyre would pluck itself, then there would be no need for slaves. Since he says that slaves are natural, there is a possible implication there that the lyre not being able to pluck itself is also natural. So once we make the revision to the idea that, no, actually, maybe the lyre could pluck itself, then this potentially opens up the category of the natural slave. Can we really have slaves by nature that God has put here to be able to operate tools? If the tools can operate themselves, then what would be the point of having people who are slaves by nature? Should we really regard these people who happen to use these tools in our form of society as slaves by nature, if it's possible to make tools that can operate themselves? So in some ways, the construction of these kinds of tools challenges the Aristotelian notion of the natural slave.
Order.
Yeah.
So Benjamin, we just did a cool video with Todd McGowan where Todd shared his thoughts on the Xenofeminist Manifesto. And I honestly, this would be something I would love to do an episode with you on. It's a short thing. You could read it in, one sitting.
Yeah.
And it would be incredible to get your thoughts on it too. The famous last line of it, and I should say, this is a kind of left accelerationist work. They don't call their work that, but it's in that vein. The famous last line, if nature is unjust, change nature. And so this has this accelerationist, techno inessentialist type of thing going for it. And yeah, I mean, they would say, well, the lyre can pluck itself, and none of these categorizations are natural. And so, do you think if Aristotle was here, do you think he would stick to his guns, or do you think he would have to revise his position in light of how much technological development has occurred and has replaced human labor?
So I think it would be difficult for Aristotle, if he was here, to have the position that he had, because he developed his position by collecting a lot of empirical documents. To write the Politics, he goes and collects the fundamental laws of all of the Greek cities and reads them and compares them. So if Aristotle were here, his method and approach would lead him to look at what's currently going on And I think it would cause him to think very differently. I think he would be very much not like Aristotle if he was around now, because of how empirical he is. I think he would probably be a thinker of history rather than nature if he was around now, because that would be what would come out of looking around. Whereas somebody like Plato, there's a little bit of a resistance to being shifted or changed by contingent events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because the forms are eternal, right? Like the
focus on abstraction and on that going up toward abstraction, whatever situation you're in where you're operationalizing or conceptualizing, what you are conceptualizing or operationalizing is always some set of abstraction. And
so
for Plato, the abstractions also all come underneath the one. So he goes all the way up to that max level, universal abstraction, out of which first a set of lesser abstractions emanate. And then as you start trying to operationalize them, then you go further down. And he even goes all the way down into artistic representations as being further down than things that have being. So, you would not only have, say, the good, then you would have the good table, then you've got actual tables, then you have sculptures of tables, paintings of tables, artistic representations of tables, tables in movies, dreams of tables, right? So, for him, almost anything that is going on can be brought in some way into that scheme and positioned within it.
So it's like he would stick more with the book of Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun.
Oh, there are new situations. There are new. The good has to come to mean different things in different contexts for Plato. So there is a plurality of ways in which it is taken up ultimately, rather than just one. There's a bit where he says that the good ship captain has to pay attention to everything that's going on. So it's not as if there's one single way to sail ships.
Which is, you have to remain open to the new, the unexpected,
Yeah. And there are certain things that are known unknowns. What's the wind speed? How high are the waves? Certain things that you might be able to anticipate, but also other things, that are further afield and harder to know about ex ante. You run into an island you didn't know was there. There's some giant, whale that lives way out there that you didn't know about. There's other kinds of stuff. There's also a point where he, in the Republic, talks about the distinction between the necessary and unnecessary desires. And he says that the unnecessary desires are those that most people can get rid of if they are appropriately educated and trained. And then he never says specifically which desires are those desires. And so you can imagine in different situations, what are the desires that most people can get rid of if they are educated and trained. It will vary enormously what is within that set. And if you were running a city over any great length of time, you would have to make revisions. Even within one generation, there would be call for revisions to this in various ways.
I think I've always been kind of amused that the word cybernetics and the word government, they're the same word. I mean, they come from the same roots, and it has to do with captaining a ship. I think government, I don't know, because I don't think government has been real. Government's not a real thing. Government it's a theater. It's the Wizard of Oz. And what's really going on is there's an old snake oil salesman behind a curtain somewhere trying to trick us all into just going along with it or whatever. But cybernetics, control and communication at a distance. So the ability to observe, the ability to interpret, the ability to influence or even command a disparate group of systems and subsystems or whatever, all kind of contained under one roof. I don't know, like I don't want to get too sensational and all that stuff, but I honestly do feel like we are turning ourselves into robots, turning ourselves into nothing more than just little cybernetic binary qualifiers. Yes, no, I will do this. I will not do that. The conversation surrounding AI and LLMs and all that stuff, it tends to be very sensational. Either it's going to cure all the illnesses and save the world and we'll be okay, or to the sensational, it's going to, the title of Eliezer's new book is If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies. So it's all always kind of sensational and stuff, but I feel like the real conversation that we should be having, is this one around this process of objectification that we're all putting ourselves through. And I think the depoliticization of politics, the depoliticization of the government itself, or the cybernetification of government, I think that's the same conversation. Talking about how, like, for you, politics is coming together and dealing with intractable disagreements. Like how do we figure this out? We're here in this world. We're the adults in the room. We have to do something to make this world habitable. But what is called politics for my entire life and for many years, for many decades, has had nothing to do with that at all. It has had only to do with, what do you like? What fandom are you a part of? What corporation do you buy from? Did you boycott Starbucks? Did you boycott McDonald's? Did you this? Did you that? So it's the depoliticization of politics by way of this distributed kingship or whatever, this Hobbesian monarch. But I think a lot of people will identify that with technology. A lot of people will say, well, all this is happening because technology. All this is happening because the internet. All of this is happening because LLMs or predictive algorithms or the search giants or Facebook or whatever. And I disagree with that. I think technology could actually be a site of radical freedom. But I guess that brings us to the question of, like, technology itself. I don't know. I think Aristotle was pro-technology from his, like, from that question of asking, can we automate necessary labor? And therefore, do we need to come up with new categories? Therefore, should we have natural slaves, or should we outsource slavery to pieces of wood and metal and ropes and stuff like that? But it seems to be the case that people are either pro-tech or anti-tech. And I'm not. I don't know. What are your thoughts on
both?
That? Like, yeah, both. I think we have to be both. I don't think technology has an essence. I don't think the essence of technology itself is in framing or instrumental reason. I think that's how it gets applied based on material conditions and, like, the political structures of the day and stuff like that. And I think we could harness it for real emancipation. And I also don't think the technology equals the economy. I think if we were free to choose our own ends, I think that would be a radical reimagining of the economy. And I think it would place new demands on technological development. than just economy equals technology. But I think technology and economy are currently like locked up so tightly together. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on technology as such? Like we're talking about intelligence and artificial intelligence that comes from technology.
Yeah. In the old game Dragon Age, there's that expression that the church likes to use in Dragon Age of magic was meant to serve man and never to rule over him. They're not anti-magic, but insofar as it seems like magic is being used to subordinate man, they'll get very, very aggressive with trying to rein it in, to the point even of diminishing significantly people's ability to use it. I think that there's a need for steering capacity. So a need for the political to still be able to operate if we're able to say that we are using the technology and that we're not being enslaved by it. And so my position with this stuff is that technological development is part of the modernization process. The modernization process cannot be stopped, cannot be undone. Trying to stop it or undo it is futile. However, there is a question of whether we can steer it. And for it to be something we can steer, it has to occur in such a way that politics can process it. So the modernization process has to kick up problems that we can discuss in terms of human values, human abstractions, and have a deliberation of some efficacy within a unit of time that's relevant to being able to act, where the activity can actually shape the thing. If the modernization process happens at a speed that's too fast for political mechanisms to work, then there's this temptation to automate political decision-making and turn all of that over to things that can work faster. But those things won't be able to choose ends, and so won't be able to steer. You'll instead be in a kind of runaway car thing. And I think this is what a lot of people are really concerned about when they talk about AI. Oftentimes they put it in different ways that make it sound like the AI is actually choosing the ends and it's just choosing really evil, malicious, or malevolent ends. But I think what people are really concerned about is a situation where the political has been eclipsed. And you have a system of administration that is revising itself through administrative modes. And a lot of the time, our political system, insofar as it's extremely alienating and absurd, strikes us as this kind of structure already. We already know about bureaucracies that modify themselves, that don't answer to anything really outside of them, that have a logic of development that is of their own, that is opaque to us, or that even insofar as we're able to understand it, we can't meaningfully intervene in it. I think that's the concern. So my attitude toward modernization and technological development is that, of course, it has to occur, but there has to be steering capacity if human politics is to remain relevant to it. And I think it becomes anti-human once the accelerationism is pushed past the point, and knowingly and deliberately pushed past the point at which it's something that people can process through political modes. Once we say, no, politics is just an impediment, it's just an obstacle to this thing, and it just shouldn't occur at all, because all it will do is make stupid interventions that will cause trouble because humans are dumb and don't know what's good for them and are bad at the thing which is said to be distinctively their thing. And this is the kind of point that Hobbes makes. And not just at the abstract level in Leviathan, but very concretely in Behemoth, where he goes through all the different religious groups that existed in Britain at that time and says, all of these groups had all of these stupid, crazy notions about God and what God wanted and what was good. And they just killed each other continuously and did nothing but bad stuff on the basis of these notions of what was good. Allowing people to think and deliberate and act, all it does is cause them to kill each other in various ways that cause myriad evils. So once you take on that kind of view, then giving people the space to do politics immediately contradicts itself, because all people do with the capacity for politics is evil. And I think to a significant degree, this is part of the lesson the post-World War II world has tried to draw from the first half of the 20th century, which is attempts to bring politics back through things like the socialist revolution, or attempts to, say, humanize the corporate through the behemoth of the fascist state. These various kinds of attempts to bring something political or human back into the picture in however delimited a way only lead to terrible, profound evil. And part of what's weak about humans is that we can't help but think that our own values are good and that acting on the basis of them is good. So if we allow ourselves to think too much about this, all we will do is come to the conclusion that we have to intervene in ways which will necessarily lead to a disaster. So what we have to instead continuously tell ourselves and each other over and over and over again is that we need rule of law rather than ruled by humans, that we need institutions and procedures and not people, because people will they have these biases, they have these particular things that they care about. All it will do is cause trouble. That's where I think the general direction of travel has been. And you have some people who have put up a resistance to technology, but most of them are not doing it on the basis of a commitment to the human or to politics, but on the basis of a concern about nature or the planet. Mm-hmm. So a kind of ecological position, which is still anti-humanist. And I think that's, most of what's going on now is that you've got technophilia, push it as fast as it goes past the point of steering. Technophobia, it's going to destroy the planet if you do that. Climate change will destroy the planet. So therefore, you have to stop. And if anything, you have to go back. And then a position of actually trying to steer it is now framed increasingly as hubristic. To think that the political can put itself above the technology seems to be hubris. I think that's the lesson people took from the first half of the 20th century. And I think insofar as people have tried to return to the political or to the social in recent years, it's a questioning of that lesson and whether there is something else we can do apart from just replicate the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm. I think the Soviet Union, well, not the entire Soviet Union, but Red Star, Yevgeny Bogdanov, Soviet cosmist science fiction guy. I think accelerationism, it's not a brand new thing. I think it goes back to Italian futurism, this kind of art movement. And I also think in the Soviet Union, especially early Soviet Union, the 1920s, accelerationism was alive and well in the Soviet world and in the Soviet kind of imagination. Because I think there always is this idea that we can build this perfect machine. And
Stalinism especially. The Stalinists became very interested in machinic administrative modes because they were trying to compete and keep this thing going in terribly regressed conditions.
Yeah. Cybersyn, 1973, was it? September 11th, when the CIA went down there and murked Salvador Allende. He was democratically elected. I think he was democratic socialist or whatever, but he was a threat to America. But Chile had designed an intranet. They had designed a computer that did centralized management of their economy. And then the CIA went in there and, took him out. And then a few years later, we had DARPANET and ARPANET and all that stuff. And I think it's a little coincidental that these South American socialists designed all this technology. And then the CIA magically has their own version of it. But this fantasy of purely automated, centralized control to get rid of all the human inefficiencies, human proclivities, maybe, I'm from this village over here. So yeah, lack, imperfection, all this stuff. For years, I was convinced. I was like, if only Project Cybersyn, if only Chile had had survived the 1970s, we would live in a radically utopian world. I don't think that's the case now. I think this vision of pure, automatic, mechanistic, mathematic, like the notion of purity itself, like this, like, oh, well, we can get all the humans out of the loop because they're just stupid. They're going to make personal choices. Of course, we're going to make personal choices. And of course, we're going to make mistakes. And of course, bad things are going to happen to good people. And that's just the way it is. Like, we are imperfect. Like, all these things, all these political movements and technological movements and all that, it seems to be a desire for purity. It seems to be a desire to return to some pure essence that I do think, again, I think it comes down to modernity and capitalism. Capital killed God, at least in the West. And rather than dealing with that, we just have been trying to remake God in our imperfect understanding of whatever that even means. But it comes down to eradicate the human, because the human is terrible, horrible, no good, very bad. They're dumb. They make mistakes. They're selfish. They're going to do things like that. And I don't know. Maybe it gets a bit weird. I think a lot of people who are drawn to the left think the left is all about sunshine and rainbows and allowing for the horrible things that people do to one another. I think that's the only utopian world we could ever hope to have is a world that's not totally fair and balanced, in a world where things break down and people make mistakes and people do bad things. But I don't think that's a politically convenient message. I don't know, like, how do we make this distinction between the human who can choose their own ends, but is also flawed and is also imperfect and also does bad things, versus this perfect machine that gets it right every single time and it's going to be fair and balanced and treat everybody the way they deserve to be treated? Like, how could we even design a politics around that? Like, making the distinction and saying, no, I am not a machine. I am a human. Or would it be a mistake to try to make that a political conversation?
Well, I think it all hit differently in the past. If you say in the Middle Ages, sometimes there's going to be a fight and people are going to do things that they shouldn't do. What's the upshot of that? Some people get impaled with the pokey sticks. Not a terribly large number of them, but some of them do. In our world, our image of what happens if people make terrible mistakes is nuclear war. It's mass mobilization armies running at each other over trenches with machine gun fire and chemicals, tear gas. So there's this fear that's much greater than there used to be of what happens when people make mistakes or when people display human frailties or foibles. There's a terrible fear of the human. And right now there's a fear generating of the machine, but it becomes a question of what scares you more. And the thing that's kind of wild is that people are still more scared of themselves. Ultimately, the reason we don't see an effort to get political control over the machines is that people are still more scared of themselves. And I think that's the World War II, World War I, Soviet Union, Third Reich legacy. And there may come a time when that is far enough in the past. But by that point, a lot of this technology and a lot of this administrative capacity will be very developed. And I would say that the post-World War II order is kind of like, if you think about the state created larger composite compound states, right? The US states came together and made the United States. And the federal government is a kind of state of states. So at that point, you have, like the representatives at the Constitutional Convention. They're all there speaking for their states. They're not there to speak for themselves or for their social unit or for, they're not there to speak on behalf of their understanding of abstractions. They're there to represent their state government. So by the time you have the federal government of the United States, you have a corporate entity that's been created by corporate entities that is only very distantly and through an alienated mechanism connected back with the general population. And then after World War II, these states come together and they make the WTO, they make the World Bank, they make the IMF. The WTO takes a little while. They make the UN. They make these further entities. And in these entities, the people who participate, they're there to personate the states that they come from. Like you at the Security Council, the person there who's speaking for the United States can't speak for themselves, can't speak for the particular state that they come from. Say they're from Illinois. They can't speak for Illinois. They have to speak for the whole entity. So that we get to a point where we have kind of third order corporate persons that have been made through successive layerings. And this is a quite sophisticated thing. And when we have a rebellion against corporate persons, the entities that are carrying out the rebellions are not people, they're other corporate persons. So, when the United States stops the WTO appellate body from appointing new members, it's not Obama or Trump that do this, although, of course, Obama and Trump do it. It's the United States, the corporate person, that does it through both Democratic and Republican presidents. So we're at a point where the most proximate source of rebellion now tends to be a different lower level corporate person rather than a social unit or a political unit. So by the time we get to a stage where people are really willing to seriously entertain political or social organizing of the kind that would allow them to try to govern or get control of this, it may have developed a lot. I think it already has versus, say, 1945, developed a lot to the point where you're now trying to confront something that's very different from what you started with. And if in the meantime, the assumption has been we shouldn't try to mess with this, we should be grateful that we live in the peaceful world order generated by the greatest generation, and we should protect and conserve this thing because it's the only thing that keeps us safe from all the terrible things that we would otherwise do to each other. If that's been the attitude for 70 or 80 or 100 or however many years it is, by the point at which people start actually trying to make an effort, they won't even know what they're dealing with. And I think that's been a huge problem for every political movement, left, right, center, recently, that has tried to actually bring back some kind of political or social engagement. People have no idea what they're even dealing with. And a lot of the time, people don't even know how to talk about corporatism as a thing. They try to go back to the 19th century and to situations that were much less modern, where there were they can point to evidence of social and political activity that seemed to work, and then they copy these techniques. So I think it starts with just trying to understand the corporate persons that now exist, and how many of them are there, and how many different types or kinds. How do they relate to each other? That's a big ask even in itself.
Yeah, I think we're in third order simulation, as Baudrillard would say. We're abstractions upon abstractions. No, I
the American
think
Civil War is a rebellion of states against a second level.
Yeah.
So you're already to corporate persons versus corporate person.
Well, and then I think now things have even probably changed in our lives radically. I think the contemporary corporation is very different. I think SpaceX is very different from GE or Westinghouse or Ford. And you throw them into now I don't know are these tech bro companies more mobile than some of these other entrenched corporations as far as like are they less tied to, like, Ford is an American company, for better or worse, even though they can ship all their manufacturing to Canada and Mexico, and Chevrolet and Chrysler, that they can ship all their manufacturing to China and these other places. They're still pretty tied to the United States, but is SpaceX and Tesla, are these more free and more mobile in any meaningful way?
Yes. So on the one hand, you now have TNCs, transnational corporations, that are much less tied to particular places. At the same time, some of these TNCs have governments as their principal customers, or are heavily reliant on governments to regulate or tax or subsidize in a certain way to be able to make money in terms of consumer base. So, for instance, if the United States doesn't have subsidies for electronic vehicles, that's going to be very difficult for somebody like Musk. And if the United States doesn't offer Musk government contracts, then that makes it very difficult for SpaceX to be a profitable entity. So there are some of these companies that are still very much tied to particular state customers on the basis of their defense companies, or on the basis that what they're doing requires a very favorable regulatory or tax environment, which is very fragile. So there's still some ability for states to pull on these companies, even though, yes, in principle, there are a lot more TNCs now that have the ability to operate in lots of additional parts of the world. So much so that I'd say it depends on which company you're talking about. Because we could look at specific industries where the quality of the industrial technology and engineering is different, in terms of how easily you can pick up and move a factory from one place to another place. That is so variable, even just by sector, how long it would take you to do that, how much cost there would be in doing that, that you have to look at it quite closely to figure out how much a particular company can avail itself of the mobility benefit. I think if you look at any given company and put it up against the state is going to have more capacity than any given company. But when you start looking at markets, like the bond market or the currency market, those markets supervene on states. If you look at overall numbers like unemployment or GDP growth or inflation, those numbers tend to supervene upon states, but they're not reducible to the particular decisions of specific CEOs or of specific corporations. They are much more cumulative than that.
As industries, they do replace humans with LLMs often. As they do that more and more, what does that do to those dynamics?
Yeah, so I think in terms of unemployment, they can generate an unemployment pressure that's significant for a lot of territorial states. That unemployment pressure can result in demands that something be done to buff consumption so that it's still possible for the stuff that these companies make to be sold. It also creates a premium on consumption. If a state has a very modern consumer economy that is able to continue consuming, even when there's a lot of unemployment or a low labor force participation rate, if it's found various financial ways to sustain across time, and this is where financialization is extremely effective. People often talk about financialization as if it's just bullshit or meaningless to the economy. Financialization plays an essential role in making it possible to continue to consume with lower unemployment rates, with lower rates of labor force participation, higher unemployment rates. But oftentimes the official unemployment rate doesn't capture the labor force participation number because it's based on people who are looking actively for work.
Yeah.
And it certainly doesn't include, underemployed people or people who are underpaid relative to the specific job skills that they've acquired. I think that that's where the United States has a big economic advantage over other states in terms of the financialization of its economy and the degree to which it's able to continue to support a high level of final consumption per capita, even with a labor force that is less participatory, significantly less participatory than it was 20 years ago. And then the question is, can you sustain that? And as that continues, the states that have the most developed financial systems will tend to find ways to continue to manage
Then
for
the
longer
idea is
periods of time.
if AI continues to develop, then AI could even assist in this process of greater financialization that sustains our new economy. You know,
Yeah, I think there's a fantasy of the moment, the singularity, takeoff, explosion, whatever, and whatever lies beyond that. It's either, I don't know, Mad Max or it's Star Trek. And I don't know. I think maybe sometimes I would be excited to live in Mad Max. But I would prefer Star Trek.
the zombie apocalypse always.
Oh yeah.
Why do so many people watch Dawn of the Dead and they're like, dude, they're at the mall.
Yeah.
They're hanging out. Like, it seems fun.
Yeah. Hanging out with Ving Rhames, shooting people on the roof with Steve Buscemi. Just, I don't know, just some weird Woody Harrelson shows up and Bill Murray for no reason.
I'm not sure if that's Dawn of the Dead, sir.
This is my fantasy Dawn of the Dead.
So it's got all the best. Just
yeah.
Zombieland.
Yep.
And Coral. Just we're throwing
Coral.
Walking Dead.
Coral.
First 3 seasons.
I think, yeah, there's fantastic visions and all that, and I think they largely serve as a source of comfort for people. I think it's disavow. I think the focus on apocalypse is trying to disavow and not deal with these fears of being replaced, or maybe the fears of the horrible things that we might do to one another or whatever. And I think the fantasy, the AI God is going to come down and cure cancer, cure AIDS, resurrect my dead relatives. I think that's postmodern Jesus. I think it's this, failure to cope with the fact that we are the adults in the room and we must make our own decisions. And I think I think unless something radical changes, the true future that's rushing or that we're rushing headlong into is like a semi-stable period of decline. James Ellis talks about zero acceleration. And I think that's the most likely outcome of kind of all the things that are happening, all the things that are going on right now. Like we're done. The fat lady has sung. The baby went flying out the window with all the bathwater. And we are locked into this process of decline that looks like maybe an accelerated 1992, 93 Russia, or, the United States is going to balkanize and then we're just going to fall apart. I don't know, but I do wonder, what do you think about the future? The immediate future, the next 30 years?
Yeah, it's interesting that people, a lot of people who think that they're too smart to think that a person can solve all of the problems will think that a machine can solve all of the problems. Dawkins will think that the machine can solve all of his romantic problems, but not a person or a body of people. I think that there's going to be, an increase in the set of things that are not done, and not done particularly well. We're going to find that the kind of decay of the social and political capacities means that there's a lot of stuff that we're just not really able to talk through and take decisions about. One thing I notice is a lot of people go, oh, they hope that things will get worse, because once everyone can see the problem, once the problem is severe enough, then people will come together and act. I don't think that will happen. I think that what happens when the problem gets more severe is that the lack of social and political capacities become more visible, because people try to use them when they realize that simply trusting the machine to take care of everything doesn't work. They try to use these capacities based on what they remember from history about what people used to do in bad times when there were problems. And they find that they've not actually been socialized and educated in a way which gives them these abilities. In antiquity, there's this notion that you have to have certain virtues, certain capacities that you have to instill in people for them to be able to politically act. Plato's got the four virtues: prudence, fortitude, moderation, justice. And each of those can sound really abstract and vague, but you can conceptualize those in ways where they have very clear, distinct, important meanings. Prudence is judging the case. Fortitude is being able to continue to be virtuous even when you're subjected to a lot of stress. Moderation is being able to not take only the purest and most intense version of your goal, and to be able to deal with the limits on what you're going to be able to do, and to be in dialogue with those limits. Justice, treating people the way they ought to be treated, given who they are, what they have done, what they can do, being able to assess people. All things that you need to be able to be engaged in deliberations with other people, come to conclusions with them, act on those conclusions, and go with the decisions that were taken, even when you don't agree with them. Sometimes you have to go along with something in politics. People are not really expected to do these things anymore, so they don't need to develop these capacities. And one of the early texts in modernity that I think deals with this very well is Montesquieu's Persian Letters, which are about how people don't even have the self-awareness that they would need to have anymore to be able to have the virtues. They don't even seem to have the self-awareness. Machiavelli reduces the virtues to just being able to get stuff done. Virtue, just a capacity of functional efficacy, which has already estranged them very much from that original context. And then in the hands of Montesquieu, it becomes evident that we don't even have any of the basic prerequisites. We can't even recognize what it is that we can't do anymore, much less then make an intervention that would give ourselves these abilities. So by the time these guys are writing, there's a sense in which the aristocracy no longer has the capacities associated historically with it. It still exists in the sense that it controls a lot of land, and it's rich, but it doesn't have the relevant capacities. And this is in part because being effective, being able to maintain your wealth, seems to conflict with having these qualities now. Being able to be effective seems to be instead about becoming a good servant, recognizing that you have to submit and submitting to these entities. And then if you submit and then you make effective supplications, you make your applications asking for this, asking for that from the state apparatus, and you learn to recognize and to think like the person who's reviewing your application. So you make an application in the terms that they're likely to find appealing. And then because they recognize that you did that, they go, yep, that was a good application. You can have your thing. In a way, it's exactly like what an LLM does. You tell an LLM, give me this, the LLM makes this application. It goes, does this fit with what it is that you want? You've said that you want this. I try to do this. Does it fit? It's a lot like applying for a grant. That's what the LLM is doing. It's applying for you to give it a grant. So it's trying to say what it is that it thinks that you want to hear. This is already going on in early modernity. And there's all of this talk, and not just in the West, but in Ming China too, about all of these problems with these ancient systems that are supposed to run on virtue, that are increasingly about people making applications and saying yes or no to them, and people trying to make the applications anticipating how the one who receives them is going to think yes versus no. And then the language becoming a tool of trying to get what you want as opposed to a way of talking about what's good. And yet the language, it's the same words and concepts being used in both cases. So it's very confusing. People are using language that is associated with the pursuit of the good, but they're using it to try to get what they want out of an administrative system. So they're, like Wang Yangming in China talks about how people quote all of the texts, but they don't know what any of it means. Mm-hmm. And you can't actually trust them to operationalize any of it if you give them a job. And yet the system of the Ming bureaucracy relies on this idea that people have these capacities and can engage in this sort of activity and behavior. So it's highly dysfunctional when people don't have these capacities, and then you start having to make changes. And the Ming system struggled to make those changes, and so the Ming were conquered by the Manchurians, right? But in a lot of Western European states, changes were made. The system was made more administrative to deal with this increasing lack of capacity on the part of the aristocracy. But it's not just a lack of capacity on the part of the aristocracy. This also can happen with the demos, too. You can make a system that's designed to fit with the demos, and then the demos can also lose over time the capacities that it needs to be able to hold that system to account and make it functional. And there was a lot of worry about this at the very early part of modernity, that if you did this kind of thing, people wouldn't actually retain a relevant level of political capacity, and the system would become very tyrannical, because they wouldn't be able to challenge it when the time came. They would be caught up in their private lives, in the habit of engaging in private life, and they would lack the capacity or even the interest in making a political intervention. And I think that describes how things are largely going. When people try to intervene politically, they find that they can't do it. They get frustrated that they can't do it, and then they start trying to avoid it, and they get kind of desocialized, really atomized, and they start looking for ways to protect themselves. And their engagement with politics is reduced to what will help me protect myself and my family. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, maybe something of the level of what will allow me to protect my nation. But I think the nationalists really overestimate the strength of that at this stage. I don't think they recognize that national commitment is another one of these things that has been very badly chewed through by the last 100 years. And what a lot of people are in is the family and friends thing, and maybe faith, maybe. And they might not even use that word for it. Yeah. But that, kind of red state, faith, family, friends, that commitment, that's the kind of outcome of this. And I think that there's a lot of that. And so there are going to be a lot of cases where there's going to be breakdowns, stuff is not going to actually work. And there's just not going to be enough social and political capacity to make a relevant intervention to overcome that breakdown. So then there will be consequences of what we don't do. And these consequences will pile up, but they won't produce a kind of moment of truth where everyone realizes, oh, we made a terrible mistake. Rather, they will tend to produce division and sharper conflict as people try to protect themselves and their loved ones from the consequences of it. But I don't think it will produce a complete collapse of the whole state system. I think what we'll see is a lot of struggles in and among different corporate entities. And a lot of it will occur at the level of second order versus third. So it will be like big states like the United States complaining about things like the World Trade Organization, as opposed to the balkanization of the United States. So rebellions by particular states against the compound state. I don't think that's possible at this point. I think those states are already washed in terms of their ability to be actors. Mm. They're already way too restricted. And this was demonstrated already in the American Civil War. The limits of the state as a check on the compound state. Yeah. That was already demonstrated. But just as people don't recognize that the social and the political are not currently in position to check the state, they don't recognize that the state is not in position to check the compound state. So a lot of the interesting activity will be at the level of the compound state, upset with the overarching large-scale supranational structure and trying in various ways to revise that. And so there's a question, I think, about the relationship between the European Union and the United States, for instance, I think is extremely interesting. because these are the large entities that can stage a rebellion and potentially rewrite the post-World War II structures. And they can do this on their own without people having to develop very much capacity. But the question that will sit in the background as all of this is going on is whether people will start to generate the kinds of organizations that would allow for a genuinely human capacity to intervene. Will there be an institutional move by even some small number of people? I don't know that it will happen, but it's something I look for at the same time. So I find myself kind of watching two different terrains. One is this kind of Hobbesian corporate, what are the corporate entities doing with each other thing, which, most of the time when people talk about that, they assume that these entities answer to the social and care about the population. But outside of the mechanisms of things like the election, that stuff doesn't really matter. Right. And then conversely, I'm looking at what are people doing socially to try to regenerate capacity to understand and intervene. And whether that the dysfunction at the level of the corporate entities is prompting that, or is it just prompting further retreat? So far, mostly what I've seen is further retreat. Sometimes further retreat dressed up as something else.
Yep.
But I'm still keeping an eye out.
Mentioning the Ming Dynasty made me want to ask a question about Anna Greenspan's essay, and machine decision is not final. She brings up.
It made me want to ask. So they couldn't pass the Chinese room. Meaning like they could perform the task, but they didn't understand the meaning of them.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think. Yeah, that's what's going on. Like at this political theater that calls itself politics, it's just going through the motions. It's just simulate. It's pure simulation.
That's what our lives are. I mean, that's how, Benjamin, if we want to continue to apply it, that's how we're slaves in a sense. We're all processing. We're all machinically functioning within this society. But none of us seem to have any idea what's actually the meaning of all of it, what's going on. And I mean, in that sense, we could kind of expand the Chinese room thing to say
we're all become Chinese rooms.
The world is the Chinese room at this point, thanks to capital.
Well, all of life is a Ming civil service exam.
Okay.
I think that again, Mu Zhongshan, I can't say his name. But he's a neo-Confucian thinker, and Anna Greenspan wrote an excellent essay in this collection. Mikey, what's it called? Cultivating Intelligence?
My copy, I was actually reading it the other night, so it's not right here.
Let's see.
But I think it's Cultivating Intelligence.
Yeah, Cultivating Intelligence, Mu Zhongshan, and AI Ethics, and Mu Zhongshan, and she gets into.
Where did we get Cultivating Intelligence from?
Yeah, that's the title. Cultivating Intelligence.
Okay.
AI ethics and Mu Zhongshan. But she gets into, I think, some really interesting questions about the nature of artificial intelligence. And I mean, I think we've kind of gone over it because in a sense she's restating orthogonality just from a Confucian standpoint rather than a Western modern standpoint. But
AI with Buddha nature.
Yeah, she talks about, what if AI, it's kind of ingesting all our syntax and all this, but along with that, it's also reading Confucius and Buddha and the Jesus Holy Bible, and it's also assimilating something called ethics.
Aristotle, Kant, Mill, Levinas, it's going to know all of it.
Yeah. But I think it still hinges on orthogonality, and it still hinges on, is it even understanding? Can it understand? Well, what even is understanding in the first place? But I don't know. I think maybe those questions are, impossible to answer. And I think that's what makes us human. The fact that there is this necessary surplus that is about us that can't be pinned down to any one thing. And I think if someone could come along and satisfactorily answer those questions in a universal way, I think then it would be showing us that we are just kind of functional machines because we can be robustly defined.
All right, I want to add to that unless you want to go, Benjamin.
Just real quick. It's difficult because there's so much we can learn on the basis that we love something and care about it, but there's also so much we can learn on the basis that we're terrified that if we don't learn it, we're going to die. So the fear and the love motivators can both carry you very far. So what motivates the slave and what motivates the master can lead to a lot of talent development in both cases, even though the motivations are completely different, to the point where the master regards the slave's motivation as less than fully human, as animalistic.
Okay. Okay. So I just wanted to say, for context and just to supplement what you said earlier, when you were talking about like people, there's a side that says it's hubris. We can't control this process. It's funny, like this is one of the core antagonisms at the heart of right accelerationism versus left accelerationism. Right accelerationism just means Landian accelerationism for us, right? Left accelerationism, it's Fisher, especially Cernacek and Williams, and Peter Wolfendale. But in the Accelerationist Manifesto, they write, Landian neoliberalism confuses speed with acceleration. We may be moving fast, but only within a strictly defined set of capitalist parameters that themselves never waver. We experience only the increasing speed of a local horizon, a simple brain-dead onrush, rather than an acceleration which is also navigational.
Yep.
An experimental process of discovery within a universal space of possibility. It is the latter mode of acceleration which we hold as essential. So I just wanted to highlight what you were saying, like the accelerationists themselves are aware of this antagonism within accelerationism, which is, can we intervene? Can we steer it? Can we navigate it? Or is it completely out of our hands? Land says it's hubris, it's human vanity, it's idealistic illusion to think that we can control this thing. Cernacek and Williams would say, no, it's not. We can intervene and we can steer this process through a new form of politics. So I just wanted to say, like, what you were talking about there is really kind of explicitly at the heart of accelerationism. The other thing is just, look, I've been going back for a secret project to all of this unreleased footage we have with Nick. And there's a point in it where today I came across this, and I'm going to reword it because he has a more simple formulation of this. But Nick essentially says, the robotic machinic substitution and replacement of human labor spurred on by industrial competition and capital accumulation is already the Turing Test. And I think this kind of brings us back to where we started, which is the nature of intelligence. Land's fundamental thesis is capitalism is artificial intelligence. Sounds cool. I think in part I've helped make it kind of his slogan, but it's easy to hear it and go, oh, that sounds cool, or that sounds dumb, however you want to take it, without understanding the nuance of it. It's like, why does he say that? For him, the industrial competition and capital accumulation truly spur on, from a structural dynamic, the refinement of the means of production. You're trying to outcompete your competitors if you're a capitalist. The way to do that is to make production more efficient, right? Cut costs. How do you do that? You do that by investing in new machines. So there's a market just to make more efficient machines to serve as the means of production. And this structural dynamic of competition and accumulation really does seem to be geared toward the robotic, machinic replacement or substitution of human labor. And I mean, I think the way Nick said it, like straightforward, is labor substitution is the Turing test. And so, I mean, what's the Turing test? The Turing test is a thought experiment proposed by mathematician Alan Turing in 1950 to evaluate a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to or indistinguishable from that of the human. So, does the Jacquard loom, for example, this is Nick's favorite example, right? The Jacquard loom you could say it has more intelligence than 400 human laborers, in the sense that its ability to perform a function is so much faster and more efficient than what it would take human laborers to perform that task. The idea is the greater the efficiency at performing a task, the greater the intelligence. So I kind of just wanted to bring it back around to like, this is Nick where he is kind of sounding functionalist, despite this whole other critique of orthogonality. And yeah, like, what do you think of capitalism is artificial intelligence? What do you think of the type of technological development of the means of production spurred on by capitalist dynamics is a Turing test of sorts? What do you think of this?
Yeah, I've been inclined to say in the past that states or corporations are a kind of artificial intelligence for similar kinds of reasons, that they give you a purpose and then they have mechanisms for achieving that purpose that are baked into their procedural scheme. So the thing about capital is that capital doesn't necessarily specify mechanism so much in the way that, say, a corporation or a state does. But we could say nonetheless that in a more abstract way, it achieves similar kinds of effects without that level of specification. So at a more abstract level, it functions as artificial intelligence. How does it realize this? It realizes this in part by incentivizing the creation of things like corporate persons. So it calls into existence these corporate entities, which then have a more specific, concrete structure, which is adapted to achieve the end. And I think that's something that probably Nick would agree with, since he thinks of the corporation as the efficient, appropriate mechanism for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
So there would then be a pretty tight hand in glove fit between those two ideas.
That's I mean, look, I mean, I guess like, so this mechanism, okay, so I'm a capitalist. I have I run a company that manufactures chairs. And so I'm in the chair market and I'm trying to outcompete the other capitalists. I want the biggest share of the market. I want to make the most money. And so if I have a couple options, I could just raise the prices of the chairs I sell. Problem is, people won't buy them because they're overpriced, right? I could cut the wages of my workers, but if they can go get paid more somewhere else, then I'm going to lose them entirely, and that's going to undermine my goal. So how do I do it? Well, based on the structural, and I would say the structural mechanism of this market dynamic, maybe I'm stretching the word, but maybe we could call it an algorithm loosely.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Like I have to take surplus value. I have to take that, invest it into new machinery so I can cut costs on my production, which gives me the upper hand when it comes to surplus value or capital accumulation over my competitors. Now, of course, they're going to find out what new technology I invested in, and they're going to get it. So it's back to square one, but then somebody else is going to have to invest in new technology. So I'm just saying, this seems like this type of virtual mechanism you're talking about in relation to the state, just an economic one.
Yeah. And of course, the key thing there is that you have to not be able to move for that to fully apply to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Because once you can move, then you can get cheaper laborers. If you can move to a place
capital
where labor
can
is cheaper.
escape, so to speak.
Right. Right. So it functions differently in a case where you have an inability to move.
You go to the third world.
Right. So this is what I think, that there's not necessarily a completely tight fit there, because one of the things capital does is it doesn't care how it increases its return, whether it can increase its return by relocating or increase its return by automating production. Doesn't matter to it. It's whatever's easier.
This is what we're getting at, like the plasticity of capitalist axiomatics, like where, yeah, the only thing that stays fixed is MCM prime or the pursuit of M prime. Like that's kind of this anchoring point. But whatever it has to do that is, up for revision.
Yeah, I think that serves as this like hypervisor. This I don't know, a super compound something, because I think when thinking in this way, Nick is not saying American capitalism or Chinese capitalism or European capitalism. Like he is taking capitalism globally, and hyperstitionally kind of positing the end result. So he sees the end result of capitalism being the escape of capital in the form of artificial intelligence that would represent the metabolized output of Earth's economy. So it's very Bataillean in this way. And it's also, again, he's thinking teleologically. So he assumes the end result. And so in this way, capital, M prime or even C prime. Like Nick's view is MCM prime also equals C prime, which is the will to think, which is the self-optimization paradigm.
The escalation of robotic capacity.
Yeah, which we see in the amassing of constant capital in favor of a variable capital. Because you can't leave
C prime
Earth.
is surplus capability.
Yeah, exactly. With much in the same way that exchange value is surplus value in the context of exchange, it's this C prime is surplus capability in the context of being applied. Like there's always a telos in this thought, and you can't, while you can go from United States to India or Malaysia or wherever, you can't leave Earth. And so like I think Nick is always making this argument from this perspective of global capital as opposed to our human perspective.
Yes, but even then it requires a certain amount of leveling to occur at the level of the planet.
Yeah.
So that there actually is this incentive to technologically innovate, which is one of the reasons why neoliberals have tended to say, hey, isn't it great that global inequality is reduced?
Sure is great.
We cannot leave. Benjamin, you've talked so much about the master-slave dynamic. What do you think of Hegel's treatment of lordship and bondage in Phenomenology of Spirit, in which he argues that and Kojève says this, the position of the master is an existential impasse. It's a dead end. It's a cul-de-sac. Hegel's not talking in terms of intelligence per se, but he would definitely say that the development of self-consciousness into spirit, the whole thing goes through the slave, that the master's a dead end and it stalls out, and it's through this friction between the two, and the position that the slave gets in, that the dialectic continues. So I got to ask what you think of that.
Yeah, I've always thought that was quite an internal critique to Aristotelianism. So it was a way of trying to develop Aristotle's concepts rather than a straightforward description of how slavery functions in antiquity.
So your point is, it's not a historical argument, it's a formal argument.
Yeah, it's a formal argument, and it also involves attaching to Aristotle's slaves and masters characteristics that Aristotle himself doesn't attach, because Aristotle doesn't claim that slaves are or aren't conscious. He just claims that they can't choose ends. There's a lot of room for what that might actually cash out in various modern categories. The subject-object distinction is a much later distinction. It's not one that you will find eminently in Plato or Aristotle. You don't even get something like what we would think of in modernity as the will until the Stoics, really.
Yeah.
So there's then an attempt, and this is an attempt that begins in late antiquity, because even by late antiquity they're trying to do this, of reading back into Aristotle and Plato some of the concepts that come from Hellenistic philosophy. So, one of the things I tend to try to point out to people is that whenever you start talking about subject and object in relation to Aristotle or Plato, there is a kind of presentism going on there, just foreign concepts being imported into really the scheme.
Yep.
Yeah.
That just aren't really there. For them,
Aristotle, right? Like, the point is, whether we're talking about human beings or whether we're talking about rocks or whether we're talking about trees or whether we're talking about horses, they are all substances. So that would imply that there's not some sharp ontological distinction between us and other beings.
Right. And, something's telos is what it's for, what its purpose is. Man can choose a purpose, right? Man is able to make a decision about what the purpose is. But other kinds of things have a purpose given by nature and then operate in conformity with that. In the Platonic schema, you'd be even more hard pressed to try to talk about this meaningfully in relation to that. Because in Platonism, you've got emanation rather than hard category separation. So that's how I tend to react to the Hegel thing. I think it's a way of playing or riffing with Aristotle's scheme in a modern context. Nietzsche also plays and riffs with Aristotle's scheme in a modern context. So does Arendt. There's a lot of different ways of taking up the Aristotelianism, but putting it into modern terminology, which then allows it to perform different functions, but also obscures certain elements of Aristotelianism. Even Thomas Aquinas can be said to be doing this. Even medieval take-ups of Aristotle involve adding a lot of Stoicism and other kinds of things into it that aren't there in the original text.
No, and it's interesting. Even something like perception, you sit there and go, which of the empiricists does he actually have in mind? Is it Locke? Is it Hume? Berkeley? And it's not really any of them. It's a kind of like general empirical theory of perception, but it's inspired by them. They're operating in the background on some level, but it's not about any of them in particular. And so I think you're right. Like the master slave thing, obviously he knew Aristotle, but is it specifically Yeah,
because Plato doesn't draw that kind of sharp distinction. And in most other ancient theories, it's not treated with anything like that kind of specificity or depth. A lot of, part of the reason why a lot of moderns, when they talk about the ancients, are talking about Aristotle, is the degree to which the church, in taking up Aquinas, takes up a Christianized version of Aristotle as its thing. So then there's being in dialogue with the church, being in dialogue with the ancient regime, which is taken to be associated with the church. And therefore, oftentimes Aristotle becomes the person that gets the focus. Not always. Marx, for instance, wrote a lot about Democritus. There are engagements with other ancient philosophers. Hegel talks about Plato too at various points. But there's a heavy emphasis on Aristotelian concepts, in part because there's so much of Aristotle that's still in the regular lingo of the church. Like if you read I wanted to ask you guys this, if you saw the Pope's encyclical on AI yet, and if you had a chance to read it, there's still so much kind of Aristotelian language that still sits in that at various places.
Is that because of Aquinas?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Right? I mean, it's still like, I know that the Catholic Church has had all these different theologians, but it really still.
It's all footnotes to Aquinas.
All bullshit aside, it's Aristotle and Aquinas still.
And there is other stuff in the Catholic tradition that they, in principle, have access to. There's a bit where Raymond Goyce says that, for the Catholic tradition to become interesting again, it has to get over Thomas Aquinas, which it could potentially do from his point of view, because there is other stuff that's there.
Do you think it could do that? I don't know. Well,
it's old. Yeah, and it's been around for a long time, and part of how it has survived is by changing a lot. All the religions that are still around have survived by changing a lot. Yeah. To the point where some people would make the case that, since Vatican II at least, and maybe even earlier, maybe Rerum Novarum, the Catholic Church has been so out of alignment with the Thomistic picture of what
with the Catholic Church.
Yeah, because the Thomistic picture of all of this stuff is still predicated on the idea that the state is a political entity, not a corporate person, not an impersonal agent.
I got one more thing I want to ask, unless you got something, Nance, relevant to this.
No, I was just going to make some smart ass remark about Pope Leo.
No, so Nance, we, with our focus on AI, we should maybe read some of or discuss some of the Pope thing.
Yeah,
you guys definitely should.
Yeah.
His approval rating right now, he's the highest approved public figure in the United States.
Yeah.
And he's got like a +30 net rating, which makes him incredibly popular by the standards of 2026, like ridiculously popular.
Didn't Trump crash out over what the Pope said? What did I miss? I saw something like Trump was pissed at him.
Well, he was that when he was saying, God, what did he say? Like, you might stay in your lane, essentially. I think he was like, or did Trump
Vance,
say?
I think said that he should be really careful when he talks about theology, which is an odd thing for Vance as a Catholic to say.
After he,
and that's an understatement on your part, Benjamin. That is
after he killed the old Pope with
shut up, Pope,
with Russian poison.
Don't talk about that.
Fucking JD Vance. Oh.
Okay, so hold on. I guess the one last thing I was thinking about throughout the course of the conversation isn't it odd? I mean, maybe not at all when you actually think about it, but in the occult tradition, they have a definition of magic, and there's little slight variations on it. I'm gonna go off of Aleister Crowley's, and I might slightly be paraphrasing. But Dion Fortune has the same thing, and it's a similar, but it's roughly something like this. Magic is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with the will. Couldn't we just technology is the science and art of causing change to occur in conformity with will. It's interesting that, you mentioned magic earlier, Benjamin, that is technology just modern magic? And we don't get it because we think magic is pulling something out of thin air, which of course, the occultists that we talk to, whether it's Nick or whether it's John Michael
JMG.
Greer, we just had a conversation with. John's always going out of his way to stress that this is not what magic is. Should we maybe at some point consider technology as magic, and that the magical tradition, the occult tradition, can actually tell us something about what our technologies are doing?
I would be inclined to want to flip it and say that magic in modernity is a way of talking about technology, and that magic as it was understood by ancient people is incredibly obscure to us now and very difficult to enter into. In part because it often involved thinking without the subject-object distinction.
Yep.
Right? Like magic in antiquity is you think it and it becomes. You know, there's a kind of and also there's, you know, magic brushes up against other categories like sorcery and theurgy.
Yep.
And then there's the possibility of the mystery ritual, which is that magic, or is that, you know, something you can talk about as a philosophical activity? You know, a lot of magic is about transforming the people who are in the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the aim of the magic is actually to change the drives of the people in the room. So it's not, and the magic works on the basis not that it is in accordance with their will, but in the sense that it transforms what they want. So the magic works, you know, precisely because it seems to be against what they want. Even sometimes it so radically alters drugs. When we talk about drugs, that's sometimes a little bit closer to magic.
And the chaos magicians emphasize that a lot.
Yeah, but drugs tend to get scientized now and talked about like they're a technology.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you go into the drug experience with a particular aim, or because you've read books about what it's going to do to you. And there's, you know, it's not like going into the Greek mystery ritual and, you know, getting the hallucinogens in some fashion. And
well, yeah. Can anybody take DMT at this point? I guess if you hadn't read them, or heard about Terence McKenna. Most people who take DMT are approaching it through Terence McKenna's, you know, thoughts on it. I guess, look, to go back.
It's not a mystery ritual, you know, where they actually keep from you what is the nature of the experience, what part of the experience has the effect. In a real mystery ritual, you don't even necessarily know where the drug is coming from, or what part of it is drugs.
No, anybody who takes DMT, it's like, okay, I'm going to do it. Time to see the machine elves. I hope they're as fun as everybody says.
They pop on a Joe Rogan episode and, you know, they pay their culturally appropriated fucking shaman white guy named Derek with dreadlocks and a patchouli oil to fucking come broom up some ayahuasca. But
so, okay, but instead of saying technology is magic, more interesting to say magic is technology.
Yeah, now whenever anybody introduces a fantasy world, magic plays the role that technology plays in our society. And there's all these demands that you have to have a whole worked out magic system, because if you don't, then there's something unrealistic about your magic system, you know?
Oh man. Brandon Sanderson has entered the chat.
And it allows you to frame Harry Potter as about, you know, technocracy.
Yeah. Have you ever read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell?
I have not.
It's a good book. It's a long book. It's a fantasy, Victorian fantasy book, but I don't know, it probably came out maybe 15 years ago. But it's good. It's very good. It's a contemporary fantasy book that I actually think is a pretty damn good book.
Mm-hmm. Learning magic is like going to college.
Yeah.
Harry was chosen to go to college.
Yeah.
Now he's been lifted out of the working class.
Yeah.
In the working class, you have to live in your parents', you know, tiny basement. You have no hope and no opportunity. But Harry you're a wizard, Harry. You get to go to college.
You're a wizard.
But beware of Voldemort, the person who believes that only the people who go to college should be in charge.
Yes. Oh man,
hey, you know what? I want to go to college. When's the Sorting Hat going to choose me?
Yeah.
Benjamin, like, so I love, these episodes of the Lack that you do at Nina, where you guys review films. I love them. I listen to them any chance I have. Sometime we want you to review a film with us. And there's all kinds of options, but I was like, yeah, we got to at least do one of those with Benjamin. We talk about a movie or maybe a couple.
Yeah, I'm down. I usually write up a little something at the start. Yeah. So happy to do that if you want the Lack experience.
That'd be cool.
Well, and on that note, we'll skedaddle. I think for me, talking about choosing one's ends is an excellent way of kind of maybe distilling this conversation and finding a way to point to what's different between human intelligence and machine intelligence. I think it's excellent. I think it cuts through a lot of hemming and hawing and obfuscation maybe and a lot of unnecessary lingo. And it shows the real difference. I think it's very easy to forget, especially in the world we live in today, where it's all about just increasing efficiency and more return and everything's a zero-sum game and we're locked in unending competition with one another for no apparent reason. And everybody seems to be upset about it. Everybody seems to question it, but everybody is helpless or seems to be helpless to be able to do anything about it. And we get locked into these machinic shapes, these machinic functions. You have no choice but to do as you're told. You have no choice but to do as the market demands, as your employer demands, as your mortgage or your rent or your insurance bill or whatever, and on and on and on and on and on. And yeah, talking about the freedom to choose one ends is a great way to elucidate the fact that none of us can choose our own ends anymore.
If that's the mark of humanity is something that we hope exists in the future.
Yeah. We have to, just like they resurrected dire wolves, we must resurrect humankind. But Benjamin, I appreciate you coming and having a chat. I hope we get to do it again soon. Everybody out there in TV land, go to Amazon or go to was it EdinburghPressUniversity.com, whatever it is. Buy the paperback now, or actually buy the hardcover too if you have cash. But Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies paperback is now available. If you have yet to read it, or if you have already read it and you would like to pick up a new copy because you're sick of reading PDFs, you can do so now. So yeah, thanks for coming on, Benjamin. Any parting words?
Thanks so much for having me. It's always so much fun talking to you guys because you always come up with really great questions and ways to take it. It always ends up going somewhere interesting and never something I can prefigure from advance, from before, like a machine might try to do.
Closing, not statement, but demand. Using your term, Benjamin, that you said before we started recording. I demand that Newport Nance makes another appearance at some point in the future.
Yep. Yeah, I got to get
guys. Have you ever seen Nance look so suave with this shirt on? Come on. Where's Nance? We got Newport Nance.
Where'd he go?
Newport Nance.
All right,
guys.
ladies, gentlemen,
awesome.
Non-specifieds, Peanut Gallery, friends, foes, comrades,
lemurs,
all of the above, lemurs, demonic entities, all of that. Thanks for hanging out and spending time with us. We will catch you on the next one.